Good evening, everyone. We're going to get started. I would like to invite everyone to take a seat. Now, the weather might be keeping some people away, unfortunately. We have, just as a reminder for everyone, this meeting is being recorded and it's also being live streamed via Zoom. So we welcome everyone. We welcome everyone online and also in person. Hopefully, we'll have more people trickle in later today. I want to start by introducing myself. My name is Romina Castillo. I'm the Director of Outreach and Engagement at CDOT, and I'm really glad you came together to join us tonight. On the screen, we have our agenda for today. I want to go really quick. We will get started with a fishbowl conversation, and I'll go over that in a little bit. After that, we'll have roundtables, and we'll have an opportunity for more conversations. First of all, I want to thank Fosca Park for hosting us tonight, and to the staff, and for the space that we have as well. And I also want to thank all our partners, speakers, presenters, and everyone who makes CMC possible. This is the collaborative. We all thank you again to all of you to come in tonight. You're part of the collaborative for being here and participating and providing your input. Sorry, we're testing Canva technology, so my phone dies every time. I want to remind also everyone, if this is your first time at CMC or not, so this is also a reminder for everyone. At CDOT, most of our engagement opportunities are very project specific, and CMC is an opportunity to kind of move away the transactional conversations and have more intersectional conversations. So this is an opportunity to talk a little bit more beyond a specific project and discuss what transportation touches and how it impacts everyone's lives. And as a segue, perfect segue for that, I'm very pleased, very happy, very honored to present this fishbowl conversation. We have our speakers tonight.
There you go.
And first we have Kate Lowe, who is an assistant professor at EUIC. We also have, associate professor at EUIC. It's very different. We also have Linda Lopez, who is a PhD student at EUIC. We have Mary Nicol, who is a deputy commissioner at CDOT, and Ruth Rosas, our director of Coalition Building and Non-Drivers Alliance. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm not going to be providing a full bio of all their amazing experience and expertise. I have a QR code on this slide. Feel free to scan it if you want to learn more about our speakers. There's also their full bios are part of our agenda if you go to their CMC website, so you can read more about that. Today, we're going to examine how information, perceived safety, and trust shapes mobility and belonging, especially in periods of heightened concern, more specifically during and after Operation Midway Bliss here in Chicago. We'll listen across different perspectives and diverse lived experiences to identify takeaways, lessons learned, and potential pilots. As I mentioned, this is a fishbowl conversation. It's a little different than a panel. So what that means is we have this inner circle here who will drive the conversation and provide their input. And then we have the outer circle, which is all of you. There will be moments when throughout the conversation, where we open up the floor for everyone to share any insights or questions for the inner circle. And I'll be the moderator, and I'll be the one providing kind of the prompts and letting you know when we open the floor for everyone to speak. And as the participants, who all of you are, inner circle and outer circle, I want to invite you all to name uncertainties. It is okay not to have the full data. Speak from experience and also try to be as specific as possible. Also avoid generalizing about specific groups, and focus on the impacts and actions. And before we actually get started with the conversation here in the room, I would like to invite Sarah from the University of Utah, who has a video to introduce and briefly a brief overview of the motivation behind the research that we're going to be speaking about.
Hi, my name is Sarah Gundera, and I'm really excited to be here virtually to introduce this really important project examining how ICE and CBP presence has been affecting transit ridership in Chicago. I'm working on this project with some wonderful colleagues, Kate Lowe and Linda Lopez at UIC, along with Anson Stewart at the Transit Lab at MIT. This project is really motivated by our shared concern over how people's daily lives and mobility have been turned upside down during these periods of heightened ICE and CBP presence and activity in Chicago. We really want to understand how people's sense of safety affects their mobility, especially around taking transit, navigating public spaces, getting to places like school and work, and just living meaningful lives in general. We see this work as a really important first step towards understanding and quantifying the social harms experienced by immigrant communities and other groups affected in Chicago. Ultimately, this work is really about making visible and overlooked disruption, how fear, surveillance, and enforcement determine who feels able to move freely through the city. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah.
I'm Sarah Gundera, and I'm really excited to be here virtually to introduce this work.
Again, we're testing our technology here. It's really something new. Well, thank you for Sarah and providing that grounding about the research that, again, as I mentioned, we're going to be speaking about. But I would like to start, as a means to also introducing our speakers. If we can do a quick wrap robin right now, and if in a minute or less, if you can discuss why is Midway Bliss a transportation mobility issue?
Thank you, and thanks so much for the invitation. So any movement in space, being on a public right-of-way, waiting for the bus, riding the train, being in a vehicle, all were moments of heightened risk, especially for Black and Brown folks, and especially for undocumented folks, but we know they were by no means the only people at risk. And at risk of terrible violence and having lives totally upended. So it's not a conversation we can sideline because it goes to the very core of what it is to have a right to mobility. I do want to recognize, however, that this is not the first time enforcement actions have hindered mobility for people. Charles Brown has a powerful book called Arrested Mobility that talks about policing and Black residents in the United States. So I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Okay.
I think that's kind of like, I would say, touching on a lot of things that I'm feeling. I think also, I guess when Operation Midway Blitz was happening in the fall, and things have continued, so like things haven't stopped happening, but like that was kind of like the most intense like period of like immigration enforcement. And I guess I thought a lot about during the fall, like, but how is immigration enforcement like shaping people's choices, and like how are they making decisions to like regarding how they're moving around, whether they're taking the bus, whether they're taking the train, or like are they taking bikes as like a form of like escaping, like. So I don't know, I just had a lot of questions in the fall, and I do think there's really clear implications, and I think just asking the question, I think, is a starting point. Like how is something like your immigration background, identity, certain identities, how does that influence how you move around, and like what choices you have really to move around. So yeah, so those are some things that I was thinking about.
Hi, everyone. Mary with Chicago Department of Transportation. Thanks for being here tonight. So I've been asked to try and give the government perspective. So I have my own individual perspective, but I'll try to keep my government hat on. So the team I oversee at CDOT, a lot of our efforts and mission is about thinking about emerging opportunities and challenges to continue to build a transportation system in the city of Chicago that doesn't require residents to own a car to get around safely. And one of the things that I was struck by during the peak of the Blitz is just through my own neighborhood connections and mutual aid contacts, how afraid folks were to get on public transit, to wait at the bus station, to walk to school, to walk to these really sacred places that we hold dear in our daily lives, and how much there was a request from our vulnerable neighbors to get rides. That was like a big request that folks were, can you give a ride to this neighbor who needs a ride to get to their job, to be able to, feed their family. So I was thinking about that layer, and then also, there were so many really cynical things about what happened with the Blitz. And I think back to in 2022 when Governor Abbott decided to start sending buses full of, folks who are trying to find a better life for their families or flee persecution, just sending them on a bus to the city of Chicago. And that was, from a government perspective, really interesting to think about when you have different views on policies, when someone is targeting you because you are upholding a policy of welcoming city, how then do you try to move government, which historically moves really slow, to try and set up safe landing pads? Everything from using tactics, I'm going over a minute, sorry, Romina, I didn't know I'd say this much, but using trying to use our authority as arbiters of the public way to say, hey, private bus company, you cannot just drop people off at the corner without registering the bus with us first. The mayor working to not allow ICE to stage their operations on public facilities. And you probably saw one of those signs that has the most words ever on any sign in the city of Chicago that says all of the legalese around what ICE is not allowed to do on our properties, to trying to work with the governor's office and support state legislation that, again, looks to protect those sacred places that people need to get to go about their daily lives.
Hi, everyone. My name's Ruth. I work for Non-Drivers Alliance. I was recently also at America Walks, and so I come from a national perspective. And one of the big things that I specifically saw was kind of the reflection of a story of my own. I was undocumented for a long time, and the fear that you face as you are on the street kind of shows you where policy and laws are not respected, or they are. And so it makes very visible something that sometimes you read and feels abstract into something that people are living. And so I think during this time, what we really saw was the ways that the law or policies are unequitably practiced, or when government does not really abide by their own what they set out to do. And so for me, and especially coming from a national perspective, we saw this like rippling effect kind of all over the place, and people feeling quite immobile during this time.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. And I think speaking of that rippling effect that Ruth mentioned, I'm going to read a few prompts for all of you to start the conversation rolling, and then we'll open up to the audience. But on that topic of rippling effect, I would like you all to discuss did Midway Bliss amplify existing mobility transportation issues or challenges in Chicago? Also, what are some of the ongoing impacts of that operation? And probably more specifically for Mary representing the city perspective, what are the practices, protocols that the city adopted in the past year to coordinate communications across departments to provide accurate information to Chicagoans and to keep everyone safe?
Good.
So anyone can jump in, not all at once.
I could start, or I thought a lot about this. I guess it's hard to measure things, especially while they're happening. But I did see like patterns of like historically like working class Latino communities. Also like I would say focal points of environmental justice efforts were like I would say like we're like kind of some of the core of like the most intense immigration enforcement, like Little Village being one of them, Brighton Park. Like we saw some like, I would say some really stark examples of like immigration enforcement. Like there was, I think Marimar Martinez, I believe is her name, the one that was shot by like federal agents. Little Village just had, I feel like they just experienced so much from, in those few months, like Greg Bovino, like I feel like he showed up with federal agents several times. And so I think I thought a lot about like how these communities had so many compounding issues that already existed. And then you get federal agents that arrive and kind of instituting more fear and, picking people off the street. And I thought about how that was influencing mobility patterns and, and hearing stories, like you hear stories online of people getting snatched up a bus stop or people like walking to work and, getting taken. So there was like all these stories that were like making me deeply think about the mobility implications. And so I do think that we saw communities that already had like certain struggles and were having to face these kind of intense immigration enforcement patterns in the fall.
So in academia, we're almost constantly told generalize, which is the opposite of what we're trying to do today. But I wonder if I could kind of try and thread the needle of acknowledging that there's really different experiences and patterns that are not absolutes biracial groups, but I'm someone with an immense amount of privilege to move through the city. I live in a neighborhood with lots of destinations. I have walking, I have L access, bus access. And that is not the case for many communities across Chicagoland. So I think I also like the idea of compounding challenges. There's communities where there's not an option to walk to a grocery store, that it is a further transportation burden to get to a school or to get to a grocery store because of differential investment. Now with a heightened layer of violence and the risk of being disappeared. So I think this, like COVID, didn't start these inequities, but accelerated and amplified a lot of the mobility inequities we see. And it's not over. There's still sightings. And to the national perspective, my understanding is in Minneapolis, there's still really quite frequent activity. It's just not in the news cycle as much.
I keep thinking about the ways that in terms of the stories that we're hearing, they're only like a snippet of what people are actually experiencing. And the fact that there are they were alluding to, there's all of these different identities that we carry. So if one of the first videos that I saw was also somebody having a seizure, and then people saying that it wasn't really a seizure that this person was, experiencing, and they were taken by an ICE agent while they were also having a seizure and carrying their son, right? And so the things that we see are only a tiny bit of what's actually happening on the ground, and we, at least like in an organizing space, we try to learn from each other of like how we can protect our communities. But it is very difficult when, again, like that, the idea that like our laws and policies are actually not being adhered to, and they come and go as people, or whoever is in charge pleases. The other thing that I really want people to like understand, and it was just recently ProPublica publication that came out, that people, even within their homes, not moving about in the city or in their community, were being scammed and taken. Like basically they were consulting with attorneys that weren't actually attorneys, and they were getting duped out of $10,000, $15,000 to make sure that they were, protected, and they didn't have to show up to their hearing. And they actually told Border Patrol or whoever, USCIS, that they were duped, and then they would get their scheduled hearing or rescheduled hearing. And then when they went to their rescheduled hearing, they were actually being taken, arrested and then deported. And so these things of like, it's not just happening within like the city that we move in, but it's actually happening in people's homes as well. And then you have this fear not only being inside, but also the things that you're experiencing inside your home. And so nowhere really feels safe. And so that's where I really think that immobility like comes into play, where there's no space where it really feels like your own. And then even like getting deported back to your country means like you're going to face possible persecution, or people are possibly going to distort you, or whatever is happening in your home country. And so I think these effects are deep, and we only see, like, when we see a video, it's only like a snippet of what's actually happening in people's lives. And so when we see those things, like, it's important for us to see, but also know that it is only in that moment, and it's not actually a whole picture.
Thanks. Something you were speaking to, Ruth, about just the nature of misinformation and disinformation, I think, and to Rumina's question around policies and protocols. I can remember one of my first vivid memories was sitting at the lakefront and seeing a military helicopter just come from the north to the south, and this service person dressed up in all of the gear, and a bunch of them just hanging out the side of the military and waving at us. I was like, what is happening? But that was very symbolic of, Chicago being a welcoming city and trying to figure out, okay, how do we respond to how disoriented people are? How do we try to provide, and this was, I think, an impossible task, but how do we try to provide a landing spot for folks? I know Romina and the Safe Ambassadors, for example, they would go into migrant shelters. I believe at the peak of when folks were being bused from Texas, there were around 23 migrant shelters in the city. And these are folks who, they've never been to Chicago. They don't know our transportation system, how to get around. There was a narrative that some of them were just getting cheap cars without insurance, et cetera. And so the Safe Ambassadors were trying to meet people where they're at and provide them information about how to get around the city safely and how to rely on other modes of transportation. I can then, fast forward again to the disorientation of the Midway Blitz. There were some coverage in the news about ICE showing up at government facilities demanding lists of names. particularly, the city's ID program. And so we were put through, just staff trainings of here's how to tell the difference between different subpoenas, which is not something I ever thought I would have to do in my job, and which ones you actually need to pay attention to, but also make sure you don't interfere. Just stay out of their way, but make sure you read the subpoena right. And I was like, I'm so disoriented about what to do here. But that was something also too we were just trying to do to protect the information from folks. And even this is the first CMC to happen in a while because of the nature of just recognizing that where we were, we try to host these quarterly, but the past few quarters, it just hasn't felt right or necessary to put potentially people in harm's way. And so trying to recognize, like, what are we hearing from local groups? What do residents need and how can we best serve them?
Great, so thank you everyone. I think we've all been hearing from academia, the research experiences, the national level, and then also locally with what the city has been trying to put in place to one, educate the staff on how to keep the staff protected and how to support as much as we can in a way we can't really support in that regard. So it has been, as Mary mentioned, just disconcerting for everyone in the city. But I want to take a pause here and open the forum to everyone here in the room. We're interested also to hear any of your own experiences, questions also that you may have, or if you want to just expand on any of the points that we've heard so far. And we have a mic in the back.
Next. Hold this. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, when you guys talked about people getting rides, and I would just echo that and say that, I have some extended family members who are undocumented or unbanked, so they couldn't even really call themselves a ride from like Uber or Lyft or something, so we were like having to do that for them because they were just not comfortable taking CTA and putting themselves at risk.
They do.
Has there been any kind of research or anything that you've heard about kind of writing and what groups or community groups or individuals did during the peak of the operation to just move around?
I can't speak to like specific examples. I feel like during those 2 months there was just so much information, and I follow all of the like mutual aid groups, the like rapid response groups, and I do remember there being something around like first like delivering food and also trying to coordinate rides to people, and other cities have done this, like trying to coordinate rides to like courts or like appointments or trying to shop for people. So I think it was like a combination of trying to do things for people if they're not able to leave their homes, and also trying to coordinate ways for them to get around if they're not, or like first off, they don't feel safe driving, or if they don't feel safe going on transit, or waiting for a bus. So I did see like that part of the conversation. People trying to, as much, I would say like, I guess like trying to alleviate as much as possible some of those barriers people are experiencing, especially if they don't feel like they can leave their homes. And if they do want to leave their homes, how do you, I guess like, it feels weird to talk about, like how do you, as much as possible, have them not engage with public space in a way that makes them unsafe? Which, I mean, that was the reality in the fall where, people were just getting snatched up the sidewalk, or like, so it's like, how do you eliminate I guess that danger that now existed and, still exists right now for people of like just inhabiting public space as you're trying to get your needs met. So I do think that was part of the conversation. I feel like I could probably find more specific examples once I dig through all of the information from the fall, but I do think it was relevant.
I would just add something more on that personal experience. And this happened. So my parents live in Elgin, where they also experienced some of those operations of enforcement. And I think those are the moments when social infrastructure became so important, right? And so with my parents within their church, they got really connected and communicated with people who were not feeling safe. My parents were driving kids to school because their parents were not feeling safe, right? So I think using your own, again, social network, they were getting texts from members of their church, and they were just driving the school bus, for some of the kids during that period.
Yeah, just to briefly add, and then, but yeah, I think that's a really good example, like the schools. I think there's a lot of examples of like, I feel like in Little Village they call it like the magic school bus, or I think the Little Village Community Council, which I think has been written about in the media, like they were like picking up kids from school or trying as much as possible, like not have parents have to go outside if they felt unsafe. And I think Albany Park also has some iteration of like I guess like a school bus where they would like go to different homes, like people that didn't feel unsafe, they would like pick up kids and they'd like walk together. So I do think there were some, at least in the school system, it seemed like there was some efforts among parents.
Yeah. If there are no other comments, we'll have another opportunity to open the floor for everyone. Just for sake of time, I would like to move to our next section of discussion. So we want to focus a little bit more of how daily travel decisions look like during those peak moments. And I have a few other prompt questions for the inner circle, and then we'll open it up for the outer circle. And so if you can talk a little bit more about, as far as your experience of research so far, what changed in daily routines, routes, times, destinations, who stayed home, and what are the long-term implications for mobility and neighborhood vitality?
Just go.
So this is like a personal thing, but when Midway Blitz was happening, I was going through a really rough medical time for myself, and since I was working at a national level, every year we do a thing called Week Without Driving. We specifically talk about people who are non-drivers. It is very different than a car-free movement because we focus on people that we call involuntary non-drivers. So people who can't drive because of illness, age, other barriers, whatever it may be. And later looking back at it, when I was trying to figure out my own, I was diagnosed with epilepsy, and I didn't drive either. I was choosing not to drive, but now I became an involuntary non-driver. And I look back at it, and we were asking people during that time to try a week without driving. And when I think about that, while these things were happening nationwide, I've been wanting to revisit that, because I do think that immigration isn't something that a lot of transportation organizations talk about. There's not a lot of focus on it and the way that we actually approach transportation, even though mobility touches all parts of our lives. And it's actually something that sometimes plagues me. I was and I know that I was going through a hard time, but I was I never, I'm the national organizer, and I never stopped and thought maybe we should not do this. Maybe this is the week without driving shouldn't be happening right now. Maybe instead we should have seized that and been actually we want to do something and address what's happening, especially because it was happening in the place that I lived. And so I think about that, and I think about how sometimes transportation people, especially non-motorized advocacy organizations don't revisit those things and kind of call ourselves out and think about sometimes the harm we actually perpetuate by doing some of these things, and it's not intentional. Like, it's not like I meant to do that or something, but it is like the ways that we actually don't hold ourselves accountable to. And so during that week, we were asking people to not drive. And maybe that was okay for, white presenting people who have privilege. And those are often people we target, we're like, come on, elected official who has the time and effort and blah, 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 to be able to try it. But we also ask individuals, and there wasn't a moment where we called that out. And so I think at least from my perspective, that's something that we should think about and actually address while we are doing some of this work, is that we do see patterns when people feel fearful and they stop driving or they stop getting on CTA or whatever it is that they usually do, and they don't move in the ways that they want to or need to, but we don't actually acknowledge it in maybe that moment. And it's okay, but I do think revisiting those moments is important. And I wonder, in this time, thinking about COVID and what had happened during George Floyd protests, and the ways that Black communities also felt really, the things that happened here in Chicago, where gangs were shooting each other, right? And there were huge fights in Little Village, that actually happened, and we didn't use those stories and that moment and those organizing times to actually revisit and talk to one another. And I definitely think had we progressed in our organizing, maybe we would have found ways to continue, and we could have supported our communities better. And so, at least for me in this work, that's something that I take into consideration now, but I didn't really have the language to put it forth. And so anyway, I know we're talking about the way people move, but I do think it's also for policy advocacy organizers, I think those moments we do need to revisit and see how we can actually help people when they can't move in the ways that they need to.
Thanks. I was just thinking about, something, I think, tying a couple of questions together, right? Some of the most amazing response that I saw to Operation Midway Blitz didn't come from government. It came from organized neighbors and networks, social networks, and, the emergence of a whistle to signify, hey, this block or this neighborhood is dangerous right now, so if you need to take another route, take that other route. And just thinking about where we're at too in the larger kind of transit conversation here in the city, right, where we have a generational opportunity to make CTA safer, to make Pace Metro more integrated with CTA, et cetera. And, I was just making a connection in my head between, it was, neighbors coming out, holding ICE officers accountable, putting a lot of focus on them, that oftentimes in those really high intense moments helped some people get out of a bad situation. And it's the same type of kind of coming together that we need to facilitate in increasing the use of our public transit system. I was just trying to, more eyes on the street. Kate, I forget from our theory class who that's from. Thank you, Jane Jacobs, the right room to remember it in. But just the nature of, we know CTA is safer when there's crowds, when people feel safe to use it. We also know that, it likely would have been incredibly helpful to think about, and I don't know, I'm ahead of over my skis a bit here, but I just making the connection that what would have it looked like if we said, hey, we're going to increase frequency on all of our public transit during Operation Midway Blitz because we know folks can't wait at the stop or can't wait at the bus stop. So, those are just a couple of thoughts that were percolating as you were talking.
Did you have something?
I can offsite.
Just a few things, and I agree. I really like the point about the frequency because I do think it's tough to imagine. Sometimes it's hard to imagine solutions to some of these things. But I did think about yeah, more frequent buses, then people don't have to wait for like 30 minutes somewhere where now it's like now the public space is unsafe for some people. So even waiting like 5 or 10 minutes, even a minute, like so I do think there's something to that. Like thinking about what can transit agencies do when sometimes it's hard to convey the intersection of why transportation and immigration matters or why are these things connected. And I think to the point of like who stayed home, I do think that and like the impact in communities, like we see the ongoing economic impacts. I feel like there's ongoing work, research, or and journalism looking at like how commercial corridors and like things like Brighton Park, like Little Village, and other like Latin immigrant communities in Chicago, like there's like an ongoing impact, and some of those things are hard to measure, like right now, because I feel like we're still kind of people are still trying to understand the impacts, but you still see it like restaurants closing or like less foot traffic, and so I do think there's something to like like at the time people change their mobility patterns, and I do think that we're still seeing that maybe people just stop going to restaurants altogether and maybe they haven't returned. So I do think there's something around like commercial corridors and like the economic vitality of communities that it still felt like like you hear perspectives of like people just also trying to understand what's happening, like oh, this neighborhood feels different, and it's hard to like obviously you can't quantify it yet, but well, I'm in this neighborhood like Little Village or Polson, and it just feels different. And I do agree with that. I do think there's something that changed in the fall, and some things just haven't returned that, compounded with also COVID, things that never fully returned back to like pre-COVID. And in terms of who stayed home, I do think there were some people that kept working, and because they had to, and maybe they like go home to work, and maybe eliminated all the in between places of like restaurants and like any sort of like non-essential, and there's a lot to read into what's non-essential. But I do think immigrants and Latino presenting people, like it didn't matter if you were undocumented, obviously like undocumented more likely to stay home, but citizens are also like targeted, and so especially like racial profiling being a big part of like what was happening. So I do think there's a lot of things we could say about who stayed home. But I do think we're still also just trying to understand a lot of what happened, because it was just so much in like two and a half month span, and so much that's also still happening. So I feel like we're just trying to sift through those pieces right now.
Do you have anything, Kate?
Sure. I just want to lift up some amazing work that's come out of the Coalition for Authentic Community Engagement and Kids for Chicago. They've started some of this work of seeing who stayed home, and they found attendance drops in Little Village, Albany Park, Belmont, Pragen, Gage Park, and back of the yards. So there's some really important work trying to make sense of what was lost, that school attendance can't be gotten back. That's gone. But I really struggle around these questions of how do we mitigate these moments of crisis, and Ruth's question of is it the right time to ask not to drive? I really struggle with, if we want a just transition, who are we asking to bear the burden of that just transition? And is that really appropriate? And how do we mitigate the harm that was happening? I love the idea of increased frequency. I think all these crises, whether it's COVID or Operation Midway, but it's, of course, lots of differences between the two, but I think they laid bare decades of underinvestment in our public goods, from healthcare to education to public transit. So reinvesting in those and changing the austerity is going to be an even heavier lift now, but that will pay dividends in future crises as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. So for the sake of time, we do need to start moving into closing remarks. Unfortunately, we need to finish this conversation, but there will be an opportunity to continue discussing this topic with Kate and Linda. We'll have a table in the back. Table number 3 will be the ones discussing these issues. But for right now, and to close this down, I would love to hear quick closing remarks from everyone. If we can keep it in a minute, Mary, that'd be great. Just everyone. If we can keep it very short and brief. And I know I'm asking a lot of you because I'm also including a prompt. So as part of your closing remarks, if you can just like summarize it as much as you can. And if you can just let us know kind of we're trying to think like how we move forward, right? And I think more specifically from the city's perspective, like what would be some potential pilots that the city could implement to improve safety in communities during heightened enforcement events or for any crisis, future crisis? I think just like piloting more innovative ideas and implementation processes. And then for everybody else, if you can also let us know, how can potentially your research or your work, if it's at the national level, directly inform like innovative practices and opportunities for collaboration with government and other entities and protocols for data sharing. I know you're all great, so you can all summarize that in a minute.
It's funny because I normally don't talk that much, so I'll just say, my CTA colleagues, I won't tell you should run a frequency pilot, but it's a good idea. But within the realm of with what CDOT controls, I was just thinking about the nature. Sometimes we do these activations where we open boulevards around the COVID pandemic and whatnot. It's all about organizing neighbors to come out and keep eyes on the street and let young people have fun skateboarding and whatnot in a boulevard that normally, folks are going through 30 miles per hour, et cetera. So I'm just percolating on that idea. It's really a challenge, right? Because we kind of in the city of Chicago govern the public way, but often we're trumped by these other, state policies and federal policies. So I don't know if I agree with this idea yet, but since I'm on the spot, I'll say something along the lines of trying to tap into this eyes on the street thing that we saw work so well with community organizations and neighborhood groups, and seeing how we can coordinate more, whether it's around, getting people to and from school or to and from work. But yeah, obviously, folks who live here, it was a really disorienting fall. It's still been a disorienting time. And so we're clearly all still processing what happened and the impacts of it. So just encourage you all to keep thinking and talking about it and coming up with good ideas for how we work through these types of challenges moving forward.
Good.
I have lots of ideas, and they are all resource intensive.
Go ahead.
So I do think increased frequency of transit yields a whole host of benefits. It's even something I read as a way to mitigate potential harassment for transgender folks waiting for transit. So obviously there's benefits for people waiting less, having less exposure to enforcement. I think the CTA would probably be happy if it had unlimited resources to try and scale up frequency. But again, there's that resource question. Speaking of resources, there's something that's being studied by UCLA in Los Angeles, the idea of a mobility wallet benefit. So what if providing benefits for folks to choose their mobility and make decisions based on safety? What that pilot has found is that people use transit, but ride-hail sometimes is transformative. So if someone has a mobility wallet, can they usually take transit, but there's an ICE sighting so they can take a Lyft? Things like that. Another resource idea with all these resources that are not coming from the Millionaire Search Arch is community-based organizations really led. Imagine what they could do with more investment. So those are prescriptions and not politically feasible because I don't know any level of friendly government that is not operating at a debt. In terms of our research, this is going to take decades to undo the harm that's going on right now. And we're hoping by understanding what happened and how public transit ridership was affected, we can be one input into that long project of repair.
I don't have as many solutions, but I'll add to something of like, yeah, I guess our interest in this research, I came about through, this conversation about, like, you're hearing stories again, like, I was paying attention to like the rapid response groups and all these groups, and you're hearing stories of people like getting taken at bus stops or not taking the train anymore, or even just like noting like, this bus feels empty or not, or I don't know, like little things like that just like made me really curious about these questions. And so I'm hoping that our research can at least answer some questions of like how did this operation impact mobility, and also like that could maybe answer questions in the future, like how might they impact mobility in the future if more immigration rates happen. And I guess I think it's also important to also just make it clear that there's a clear intersection between transportation, mobility, and immigration, which again, like, doesn't always seem like a clear connection to people. So I think our research can hopefully just make those intersections clear, and and hopefully just invite more conversation, because I do think there's maybe too much data sometimes, but I do think this research is interesting, and I feel like we're trying to add something to the conversation that hopefully, I think gives light to potential solutions if we fight funding.
I think one of the things that we've heard from Minneapolis and organizers there is like work within your block, so get to know your neighbors. So I think some of the solutions that can be feasible for us, or that things under our control, as we don't maybe make certain decisions about federal funding and things like that, is like get to know your neighbors, get to know people around you, actually make those connections and like share your story, listen to other people's stories, and kind of open up and be vulnerable in that like space. Because I think like the more you get to know the people that actually live around you, the more you can help them or they can help you. It's just like the survival instinct of humans, right? We're social creatures. So I think to me, that's like one of the big things that has motivated me to continue in this work. And also like don't lose hope. I do think like we can imagine a different world. And that's like why I do this work. Sometimes I get really down and I'm like, no, there is a different world. And so, at least those are the things that I think that are under my control, and that's helped me so far.
Well, thank you both for that much lighter note and ending us on that. And I want to take one last opportunity to open the floor for everyone. So if there's anything that you might want to share with this group, with our speakers about your own experience or questions that you may have for them, this is the moment.
I'm not sure if this has already been asked, let's answer, but I think I'm one for the thing.
It is.
I'm gonna get the windows open right after all this. So,
Okay, one. And I'm sorry for pulling on the doors. I didn't know that I had to come down here because the table was up there. So I apologize for that. Sure. First of all, thank you all for being here. Y'all are so cute. I don't know if that's like politically correct at this point, but it's been a long day, and I'm glad to be here with you all. My name is Tyler. I work at CTA currently in our Equity and Engagement Office, Government Community Relations and Legislative Affairs, and I'm grateful to welcome Nita. I am. Very much a beautiful new beginning for change to occur. So I'm glad that these conversations are happening and the rooms are still filling up, even though we've passed this big hurdle, there's still so much work to do. And in the spirit of acknowledging that and celebrating the fact that, you know, CTA just had that red line extension last Friday, that groundbreaking, amazing. 50 years of delay and denial for that community is now being restored. Beautiful. I would like to know, what things do you already know about the authority, and maybe more about the employees that'll be there, and how they fit into transforming how things will be shaped in the future going forward? Because that's a massive population. That's almost, what, 11,000, 12,000 people we employ. And besides the dedicated work that they already offer, they're energized to do more. That's why we have the holiday train. That's why we have, you know, dance events and all of these things that comes from the employees. So how are we going to keep them involved and engaged and informed on what else they can do to help keep this alive and keep this growing? Is that a real question? Did I ask a real question? Okay, cool. All right. Because I know I was just talking to the
I'm scanning the crowd here, and there's probably, this might be a good question to outsource, but so anyone else want to jump in? But I can give you my thoughts. I mean, there were a few questions in there, right? Which is, what do you know about it? And I think from a CDOT perspective, right, we're responsible for stuff that happens in the public way. And then obviously, you know, we advise elected officials, mayors, et cetera, on transportation issues. And so for folks that aren't aware, you know, officially the law goes into effect on June 1st, so very soon, a little over a month. And then by the end of September, all of the various board members need to be seated. And so the way the governing body is set up is that those board members need to be set so they can make decisions about some of the questions that you're asking about. And so a critical process that's happening right now, right, is the governor, Cook County president, and the mayor are considering, you know, who are those board members going to be, and how do we ensure we get the expertise we need, everything from workforce development to business management to transportation expertise, to have folks that are thinking about not just how do we provide world-class public transit service, but what is the experience like for the lifeblood of the organization, which we know are the folks that are running the trains and the buses and whatnot. I think so much is to be determined, right? And as we know, Chicago is an incredibly political city, but I think it's folks in this room who can continue to advocate for and make sure that the vision for what NEDA is comes to fruition. But I do think it's going to take many years for that to happen.
Montez.